Okay. I will be talking in terms of ratio analysis right now. I've never done this before, by the way. If you recall, finance has three primary areas of responsibility. Ensure that the bills are paid, analyze capital budgeting, and project into the future, project the financials into the future. Now, in order to do these things, basically finance has to anticipate the future. Difference between finance and accounting. Accounting deals with the past. Finance projects into the future. Not something to be taken for granted. It can be very tricky to project into the future, right? None of us have a crystal ball, unfortunately. So, what we need to do is take a look at the financials that we have available. What's the best indicator of the future? The past. Okay? All right. We need a few analytical tools to figure out and make the financial statements more understandable, more readily understandable to us. What kinds of analytical tools? The first one, the one I'll be talking about today, is ratio analysis. Now, this is a very basic financial statement, the balance sheet. Unfortunately, these tend to quit.
Try that marker. It's good.
Okay. Now, can you see that?
Current liabilities, long-term labs, and equity. Yes.
Okay. The first ratios that I want to talk about are called coverage ratios. These address the first of finance's primary responsibilities, which is to ensure that the bills are paid. Now, the difference between current and long-term, as we should all know, is 1 year or less is current, longer than 1 year is long-term, okay? So, when we talk about the bills being paid, what are we really talking about? We're talking about current liabilities. These are the liabilities that are going to be due within 1 year, okay? Now, what are we going to use, assuming that the expenses, the operating expenses are covered by the revenue? In other words, assuming that the income statement stands on its own, what are we going to use to pay the current liabilities? We're going to use current assets, right? So the first of the coverage ratios is called the current ratio, which is current assets divided by current liabilities. Now keep in mind, I'm going to be projecting financial formula, and that's fine, but I want you to really focus on what does it mean? Okay, it's one thing to know how to put something together. Yeah, this is called the current ratio. But what does this tell you? What this tells you is how much in current assets do you have relative to your current liabilities. You know, current liabilities by definition are going to be things that you owe within a year. Current assets are what you're going to use to pay those. Well, how much coverage have you got for your current liabilities? Have you got a lot? In other words, is the ratio 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 1? If you're Google, it's 10 to 1. And yes, that's actually true. Or are you kind of on the brink and better watch out? Have you got a 0.8 to 1? You know, do you not quite have enough to cover? That tells you that there's problems potentially coming up very quickly. Okay, so that's the current ratio. I want to talk a little bit about something called liquidity. What is liquidity? Liquidity is how close is something, how close is an asset to cash, okay? And in fact, you will find every balance sheet that you look at will have its assets listed relative to how close it is to cash. So for instance, what is the first asset that you'll find listed on every balance sheet? Cash. Because there's not a lot of things closer than cash to cash, right? I know, sounds silly. What is the second thing listed on the balance sheet? Marketable securities or some such like that. When a corporation has too much cash for a short term, it doesn't just want it sitting there, so it may invest it. That's called marketable securities. How close is it to cash? Like that, a choice of selling it and turning it into cash. Next up on the hit parade would be accounts receivable. How close is that to cash? Well, you gotta get paid, but it's pretty doggone close. If your terms are net 30, maybe it's 40, 45 days. So you're gold there. Next up would be sellable inventory. Now you're getting a little further in the liquidity context. You're getting a little further from cash. Okay, still a current asset, but it's further from cash. So, the next ratio that we're going to talk about is called the quick ratio, which is the same, but it subtracts out inventory. Now, by subtracting out inventory, what does the quick ratio tell you? It tells you how much coverage you've got in very liquid current assets compared to current liabilities. Okay? So, in effect, in an emergency, if you had to pay it all off pretty doggone quickly, how much do you have, how much coverage do you have to do that? Okay? Okay, so those are the coverage ratios. Next up on the hit parade, we're going to look at asset management ratios. In particular, accounts receivable and inventory. Just occurred to me, how much time has gone by?
10 minutes.
Okay. Now, accounts receivable, the ratio is called the average collection period. Or ACP. Okay. This is accounts receivable divided by average daily sales. So, what that tells you is on average, the number of days from an invoice being generated to having cash for that. Okay? So for instance, if your accounts receivable is 45,000 and your annual sales are 365,000. What that would mean is you've got 45,000 as the numerator and 365,000 divided by, let's see, how many days in a year are there? 365. So that's 1,000, which means you have a 45-day ACP, average collection period. Okay?
Mark,
Now,
12 minutes.
okay,
Want me to hit stop?
yeah.